I'm Glenn Greenwald, filling in this week for Jeremy Scahill, and we're back here on Intercepted. Joining me now is the Russian-American journalist and activist who has been an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin as well as Donald Trump. Masha Gessen, welcome to Intercepted.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy you're here as well. And obviously one of the things that we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about is the debate which has dominated the news in the United States for, I guess I'd say, roughly the last year or so, which is the debate about Russia and its relationship both to the United States and to the Trump campaign first and now the Trump presidency. And one of the things I find very interesting about talking to you about those topics is that this debate has been incredibly polarizing. People are firmly entrenched on one side of the debate or other because of the stakes that are the high stakes for both parties and for people's political fortunes. And yet you've been, I think, quite nuanced in your commentary and analysis. On the one hand, you are a vehement critic of Vladimir Putin and have been for a long time. You have very, I think, clearly warned of the dangers he poses, not just domestically, but also internationally. And yet, on the other side, you have often been skeptical about claims made by the U.S. government concerning the role played by the Russian government and Putin specifically in hacking and in other matters. You've called for more evidence. You've also warned of some of the kind of extreme conspiracy theories and hysteria that has consumed the debate at times. And I want to talk to you about the specifics of all of that. But first, I wanted to ask you something that I've heard from actually a lot of people who were born in Russia or who are Russian citizens but have lived in the U.S. for a long time, who have said that the climate in the United States, because of heightened tensions with Russia and the nature of this debate, has become kind of oppressive, a little bit intimidating. They feel somewhat like they're being castigated unfairly as Russians, that everything Russian has become toxic. And I wanted to get your view on that as somebody who was born in Russia, who lived in Russia for a long time recently, and now works in the U.S. What do you see as being the climate here for people who are Russian?
First, I want to say that I'm not alone in trying to offer a nuanced view. And in fact, I think that people's willingness to latch on to this conspiracy theory that basically says that Russia gave us Trump is inversely proportionate to their expertise on Russia. The more people know about how Russia works and how Putin works, the less likely they are to sort of embrace it wholeheartedly, which is not to say that they're denying or that we're denying or that I am denying that there was any Russian interference. But what I've taken to saying is that the possible existence of a conspiracy is a poor excuse for conspiracy thinking. But to answer your question about how Russians are perceived, I mean, I haven't felt it myself, I don't think. I'm not aware of my friends feeling it, but at the same time, most of my Russian-speaking friends are queer New Yorkers, asylum seekers or asylees who don't spend a lot of time in the larger sort of Russian immigrant community, which is actually total Trump land. And that's been one of the small tragedies of the Trump election, is the way that families of Russian immigrants here or communities have broken apart along this incredibly polarizing line of whether or not they supported Trump. For the larger Russian public, it's been flattering and fabulous to see that their president has appointed the American president. I mean, Putin took a victory lap during his annual press conference in December on the subject of the American election. And he very much feels like the most powerful man in the world. But, the fact that I haven't felt it personally is not to say that I haven't observed it personally. And most recently, there was a tweet out from Donna Brazil. So there was a Russian tweet demanding that property be restituted to the Russians. And Donna Brazil tweeted, "Now communists are dictating policy." And that to me,
it's amazing.
It's like the apogee of, this completely unself-consciousness sort of remake of the McCarthy era, but as even more farcical.
Well, I wanted to ask about a specific comment that you made along those lines in an interview that you did with Slate, where you said, quote, "We're seeing the reemergence of Russia as the ultimate toxic paintbrush you can scare anyone with and hope that it ends their political career." What did you mean by that?
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, we were talking on the phone. What I said was smear and not scare, but scare works as well. But what I mean is that there's a definite feeling among Democratic Party operatives that as long as you can taint somebody with a Russia connection, that person's political career is over. It's magical thinking on the face of it. In fact, from everything we know, voters don't particularly care about Russia. Certainly not Trump voters don't particularly care about the possible Russia connection. But there's this magical idea that if you sort of create enough of a cloud, a Russia cloud, and get it to attach to the current administration, it will somehow spell the end of this administration.
And why do you think that's and I think that word actually, I'm glad that you corrected that because I think it makes even more sense now and it's sort of more, it's a stronger claim that way. Why do you regard that as kind of a smear tactic or a toxic paintbrush? I mean, what about the view that Russia is an adversary of the U.S. government. Russia attacked the U.S. Through hacking and through other means. Russia is supporting extremist right-wing parties throughout Europe and here in the U.S. as well. And therefore, people who meet in secret with Russians ought to be held at least under a suspicious light, if not a guilty one.
Well, because we live in a world in which Russia is a major player, perhaps not as major as Russia would like to be, but it is still very much sort of a part of world politics. And when it gets to the point where meeting, say, with the Russian ambassador is perceived as somehow suspect, when it's the ambassador's job to meet with people. And when we find out that the supposed secret meetings were actual conversations had at cocktail parties during the Republican convention, which is like the purpose of those cocktail parties is to give people access to one another and to facilitate socializing. That's what a cocktail party is for, especially at a thing like the Republican convention. And so when that becomes toxic, then what we see happen is the pathologizing of sort of normal political practices. That breeds paranoia, and that doesn't actually constitute a response to any real danger. The danger posed by Russia does not reside in conversations with the Russian ambassador.
Obviously, there are differences between the McCarthy era and the climate that is prevailing now, among which are the fact that Moscow is shaped by a completely different ideology than it was in the 50s and 60s. But do you think there are similarities in terms of the way in which this kind of, as you call it, a toxic paintbrush is being used as a smear on people to sort of deter them from questioning claims about Russia or from deviating at all from standard orthodoxy within U.S. opinion-making circles?
Well, absolutely. And I wouldn't even say that there were similarities. What I would say is that there's a legacy. That the reason that this sort of idea has caught on so fast and the reason that so many people perceive it as such an effective political tactic is because that reflex is still so familiar. And that's why, I react so strongly to something like the Donna Brazil tweet or the Time magazine cover from a week ago or 2 weeks ago that had a picture of Don Jr. on the cover and said, red-handed, right? Those are clear references to the communist period, to the Cold War. And I find it nauseating that people are willing to claim the legacy of the Cold War so readily because it's politically expedient.
Now, I wanted to ask you about a article that you wrote in the New York Review of Books in March that was headlined Russia, the Conspiracy Trap. Now, that was 4 months ago. There have been a lot of headlines made about the Trump-Russia connection since then, not necessarily all of them or even any of them substantive in terms of providing additional evidence. But I'm curious to know whether your view on those particular points have changed significantly over the last 4 months since you wrote it.
I wouldn't say they've changed significantly. I mean, I think that it's not quite as strongly intelligence leaks driven anymore as it was 4 months ago. My basic issue with the Russia story stays the same, and which is that, I think that conspiracy thinking is dangerous to politics, The way I would phrase it now would probably be a little bit different. The way I would phrase it is that conspiracy thinking, in a way, it's a symmetrical response to the rise of Trump. And Trump has succeeded largely on promoting a aggressively simplified view of the world that basically sort of says, look, this modern complicated world is too scary to live in. Here's a recipe for making it simple and livable and comfortable and not quite as frightening. And the rise of that kind of leader almost always calls forward all kinds of conspiracy thinking in the opposition as well. And I feel that that's exactly what's happened.
Did that happen among Russians
absolutely.
who are opposed to Putin?
It's happened among Russians who are opposed to Putin. And I think that my basic problem with the Russia conspiracy theory remains the same, which is that it's like the one-size-fits-all theory that tells us how we got Trump, which is that he's a Russian agent, and that gets us out of the really frightening and complicated task of understanding how Americans voted for Trump, right? And it also creates this idea of how we're going to get rid of Trump, which is that magically, again, and I keep using the word magically quite consciously because there is no straight line from any amount of Russia revelations to an impeachment. Not to mention that there's no straight line from impeachment to actually getting rid of Trump. But magically, people believe that if the Russia collusion or the Russia conspiracy is proven, then that will somehow get rid of Trump and the national nightmare will be over.
But I want to ask you to zero in for a minute on this specific sentence in your March article from the New York Review of Books, in which you said, nor have we yet been given any hard evidence of active collusion by Trump officials. Now, at the time that you wrote that, collusion was used to mean participation by Trump campaign officials in Russian hacking, either before the act itself or working collaboratively with them on how to distribute the fruits of the hacking. The goalposts have kind of been moved about what collusion means ever since the Donald Trump Jr. emails came out, in which it was proven pretty definitively that Trump officials, including his son, were willing passively to receive dirt about Hillary Clinton from Russian officials, much the way Democrats were willing to receive dirt on Trump from Ukrainian officials or even from Russian officials. But on the question of whether there's any hard evidence now, 4 months since you wrote this, showing collusion between Trump officials and the Russian government on criminal actions such as hacking, I personally don't know of any hard evidence 4 months later after you wrote this that has been presented publicly. Do you affirm this statement still?
Yes, I absolutely affirm the statement. And furthermore, I would say that what we learned from the Don Jr. email exchange was that he basically said in secret, in a confidential email exchange, exactly the same thing that his father said in public. His father said in public, please get the emails addressing the Russians. It's actually, this is another hallmark of conspiracy thinking. When we attach more value to something that is said in confidence than to the exact same thing that is said in public.
If we convince ourselves that the reason Trump won was because the Russians engaged in nefarious behavior and dastardly deeds and kind of implanted this Manchurian candidate and manipulated corruptly the American political process, which used to be pristine and yield positive results, and that's the only reason why was because this bad foreign regime gave us Trump, and then we get to believe that he's not really an American phenomenon, which I absolutely think is a big part of what's going on. But I wonder if you agree with the following theory as well about why this conspiracy thinking has become so attractive, which is there's this underlying collective sentiment that you find in a lot of countries where people are just extraordinarily furious and disgusted with and angry about the prevailing political order. In order to address those underlying causes, we have to kind of confront a lot of unpleasant questions about ourselves, like did we embrace policies as an elite class that kind of recklessly or indifferently trampled over people's security? And do we need to change those policies in order to prevent those people from continuing to suffer and embrace radicalism and extremism? And instead, it's so much easier to just say, oh, this was the Russians who did it, because it relieves us of that responsibility. I'm wondering, A, if you agree with that, and then B, whether you share my confusion about this eagerness to get rid of Trump, because even if you get rid of Trump, the sentiments underlying Trump's election aren't going anywhere. In fact, they may actually worsen or become more extreme if there's a perception that their democratic choice has been reversed. So I'm interested in your view on that component of this conspiracy thinking.
So I think you're right. I think that part of the reason that the Russia theory is so compelling is that it gets us out of considering our, us, sort of the educated class, the wealthy, whatever, the political class, out of considering our own culpability for the rise of misery, right, that fuels the rise of somebody like Trump. But I think it's even more than that. I think it's, in a way, it's, again, the mirror of that misery, which is that it's a fear of complexity. It's because if you consider what we need to challenge, what kind of sort of accepted political wisdoms need to be challenged in order to really try to come to terms with why people voted for Trump, then all sorts of things that we hold to be self-evident in the contemporary political world begin to topple. And we suddenly find ourselves, and again, by we, I mean, people who are comfortable in the current political sort of disposition, we suddenly find ourselves as disoriented, as frightened of all the things that start tumbling down as the people who voted for Trump. So it's a real fear response. It's the don't drag me down into your abyss kind of response. Because if I look into your abyss, I will find an abyss of my own. Another aspect of it, which is related but distinct, is that the longer this goes on, the longer we watch Trump in power being unhinged, the more compelling the Russia conspiracy becomes for another reason, which is that at least somebody is in charge. If you imagine that Putin is a cunning mastermind who's really secretly taking over the world, then at least somebody is in charge. Maybe an evil grown-up, but a grown-up, right? I, having met Putin and having written in great detail about him, can tell you that he is actually not that different from the insane clown president that we have here. And nobody's in charge. Nobody's driving the bus.
So I know that there are going to be a large number of people who listen to this discussion who are going to respond with the following. I'm sure you've heard it a zillion times. I certainly have. Okay, it's all well and good that you're warning about certain kind of particularly unhinged people engaging in conspiracy theory. But the fact remains that Russia attacked our democracy. Putin ordered the Democrats hacked in order to help Donald Trump get elected, both to sow chaos in the U.S. and weaken our democracy. And I want to ask you about that particular claim by asking you about something that you wrote, again, in the New York Review books back in January, when Homeland Security issued what it called its report about the election year hacking, which was instantly accepted not just as evidence, but as proof, I think, widely through the U.S. media and kind of the chattering class. And it was issued on behalf of 3 different intelligence agencies, and it essentially concluded that not only did the Russian government, not only were they behind the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's emails, but that Vladimir Putin himself specifically ordered it with the intention to help the campaign of Donald Trump. And about that report, you wrote, quote, "A close reading of the report shows that it barely supports such a conclusion. Indeed, it barely supports any conclusion." Do you still agree that 6 months later, as of to this date, the U.S. government still hasn't presented any concrete evidence on the kind of original core question of whether not just Russians, but specifically the Russian government acting under the direction of Vladimir Putin ordered the hacking of John Podesta and the DNC's emails? And secondly, do you think that it's plausible that if America's top intelligence agencies unite unanimously with high confidence in support of a conclusion that there's really any meaningful chance that that's so fundamentally wrong?
I'm not saying that it's so fundamentally wrong, right? I'm not in a position to question the claim that John Podesta's email was hacked on orders of the Russian government. I think the idea that they were personal orders from Putin, at this point we haven't seen any evidence. It's entirely plausible. And it seems reasonable to claim the 2 email hacks carried out by 2 different actors were affiliated with the Russian government and possibly carried out on Kremlin orders. My issue is with the leap from that to influencing the outcome of the election. Right? Because this is where the argument gets problematic. Basically, what the intelligence agencies are arguing is that the Russian government hacked the DNC and used the product of those hacks to influence American public opinion out in the open to help Donald Trump. The illegal and problematic part of it is the hacking. But then with the participation of the New York Times, the Washington Post, a variety of cable channels, the products of those hacks influenced public opinion, which influenced the outcome of the election. Whether or not that kind of influence was actually legitimate journalistic activity on the part of Americans is something that we need to have a conversation about. Let's accept the one claim of fact, right? I mean, you can't argue about facts. So I can say, okay, I'm not willing to accept that claim of fact unless they show evidence, or I can say, okay, fine, let's assume that that's true, which is really what I'm saying. Let's assume that Russians hacked the DNC and gave the products of those hacks to WikiLeaks. Let's assume that happened. How does it amount to Russia conspiracy to influence the election to throw it to Donald Trump? It doesn't. That's the problem.
Well, I want to thank you so much, not just for taking the time to talk to me today, but for your work on all of this over the past year. I think it's been really invaluable the way you've brought your expertise about Russia to this debate, which has been sorely lacking in expertise. So thanks very much for both of those things.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for being a voice of sanity.
Masha Gessen is a journalist, and you can follow her on Twitter at Masha Gessen.